Hoş geldiniz değerli konuklar. Zeyrek Çinili Hamam Kitap sohbetlerinin 5.sinde buluştuk. Bugünkü konuğumuz Albert Müzesi Ortadoğu Sanatları bölümü küratörü Tim Stanley. Tim bu projenin çok başlarından itibaren restorasyon sürecinde de Hamam'la iletişimi devam ettirmiş biri. Hamam'ı çok yakından tanıyor, ekibi de. Burada olmasının önemli nedeni de Çinili Hamam, Çinileri 1870'lerden itibaren sökülüp Avrupa'nın muhtelif şehirlerinde satıldı ve dünyanın belli başlı müzelerinin koleksiyonlarında yer alıyor ve Victoria ve Albert Müzesi sayı itibariyle Çinilerin en çok Çininin bulunduğu koleksiyon. 37 adet Çini var orada. Kendilerinin yaklaşık 1000 parçalık Çini koleksiyonları var. Bugün Tim'le Çinilerin buradan, İstanbul'dan muhtelif yollarla ve farklı kanallar izleyerek Albert Müzesi'ne nasıl ulaştıklarını konuşacağız. So Tim, I made a brief introduction. Well, you know better than I do that Albert has the largest collection of Çinili Hamam tiles as a public institution. So, how did this become? Could you tell us about a short history of the Albert Museum and how they started collecting these tiles?
So, the Albert Museum is a product of the Industrial Revolution, but it didn't. The Industrial Revolution in Britain begins in the 18th century, and at that point, there are no rivals to Britain as it invents new ways to produce goods, new goods and old goods more cheaply. And but when we come into the 19th century, France industrializes too, and Belgium. So for the first time, there's a competition. And France actually had already had a system for educating designers, and this was completely absent in Britain. So by the 1830s, it was a real political issue that we had technical advances, but we didn't have the design quality to go with it. And there's an event in Britain, which is 1832, which is the Great Reform Act. And this changed our parliament from being organised along medieval lines to being a modern parliament that represents the great cities that had grown up in the late 18th and 19th century. So it's quite a revolutionary act, although of course the suffrage was limited to property owners. It wasn't universal suffrage, but it made a big change. And the new cities like Manchester and Leeds and Birmingham were represented in the new parliament by people who were against the government, and they started to cause problems for the government. And one of the things they demanded was the creation of a design education system. And so in 1837, the opening of a system of schools of design happened, and when they were created, the school started to collect objects that the students could copy as examples of good design. And it began to train people. But in 1851, we had in London, very close to where the museum is now, we had the first international exhibition of industrial goods, which was called the Great Exhibition. And it was a huge success. It produced a very large profit, and it was visited by an enormous proportion of the population, which was 18 million at the time. So having 6 million visitors was very impressive. So they decided the people who ran the exhibition were under the protection of Prince Albert, who was the husband of the ruling queen, Victoria. And so they decided to reform what was going on, because, what I didn't say was that everyone decided that the exhibited goods in 1851 didn't yet show good design. So they needed to do something to improve it. And so what they did was they took the schools of design and they separated from it the collection of objects that they'd made and they created an exhibition, they created a museum that was open to the whole public and not just the students. And they carried on developing the school in a more controlled way, and that's now the Royal College of Art. Whereas the collection was called the Museum of Manufactures, then it was called the Museum of Ornamental Art, and then in 1857 it was moved to a new site, which is where it is now, and it was called the South Kensington Museum. So when we began acquiring Çinilerin Hamam tiles, in fact it was called the South Kensington Museum. And that museum was dedicated to collecting objects which were good examples of design that could be copied by manufacturers and the artists who worked for them, because we didn't yet have the term designer, and also that it should be open to the public, because they said the problem with Britain was British people had very bad taste, and that in order to create an internal market for well-designed goods, you had to train the public as well as the manufacturers. And so that's the mission that it started with in the 1850s. And it worked, because Britain became the home of much better design, so that by the end of the 19th century, the French design was under stress, because it wasn't, they weren't keeping up with the British, and so they then created the equivalent of the V&A in Paris, which is the Musée des Arts Décoratifs. So it's that sort of impulse. The government gave the museum sufficient money to buy, from everywhere they can get it, examples of good design. And so the collection of the tiles, which comes towards the end of the 19th century, is part of that mission.
So, thank you for the brief introduction of the museum's history. So, how come the museum started collecting tiles? What was their motive?
Well, something happens in terms of the architectural decoration in Britain during the 19th century. So we have we had to have this period before when wall tiles had been used in Britain, which was under the influence of the Dutch, who'd started to produce Delft tiles. So British people in the 18th century, 17th century and the 18th century, they used these blue and white tiles that either were imported from Holland or which we made ourselves. But they went out of fashion by the early 19th century. And so the current, in Britain now, and as in France and the rest of Europe, it is absolutely standard to have tiles in your house, wall tiles. But in the middle of the 19th century, that was not the case. And so something happened, which was the idea of using tiles became more current as the second half of the 19th century went on. And the way that historians of British tiles tell the story, what happened was that in the 19th century, there was a passion for religion. I mean, there was a religious revival, and people started to restore our medieval churches. And in the medieval churches, it was common to have a special sort of tile as a floor tile. And in fact, floor tiles have been the common use of both tiles of different techniques during the Middle Ages and into the modern period. And so people started to create new tiles of this type for the flooring that they put in, the sort of medieval style flooring that they put into churches. And then they began to use that for major neo-Gothic buildings, such as the Houses of Parliament in the 1840s. And then this sort of gave them the idea of also producing the tiles that were used for walls, which they had learnt about from works. And a key area that influenced Western Europeans was actually Western Europe, because, of course, they had wall tiles in Spain and Portugal, which had been inherited from the Islamic period. And so it became it began to become a fashion to use tiles, and some of the first ones that were produced were imitations of Spanish tiles, but then they began to look elsewhere, and it's that seeking of patterns for tiles that leads people to collect tiles from Turkey.
So the main ambition and drive was to collect tiles for the purpose of design, I think, and not as historical objects. So which brings us to how the collection started to be formed, and what were the key people in the Victoria and Albert Museum, or the South Kensington Museum for that matter, at the time.
So the museum obviously had set out with this mission of collecting all types of products from elsewhere that were considered considered good examples of design. And there was also an element that you would collect objects that were actually in contemporary use in other parts of the world, so you could make them industrially and cheaper, and you could make exports to those countries. So it's a sort of, there's a little bit of industrial espionage included in this process. But the story of the rise of the wall tile in Britain was not followed very closely by the people running the museum. And so by about 1890, when this person called Caspar Purden Clark comes onto the scene, we had collected some Ottoman tiles, but not in a systematic way. And so in the 1890s, he starts to make an effort to collect Ottoman tiles. And so we begin the 1890s with a very poor random collection, but we end the period, the 1890s, with a collection which includes some very good examples.
And I think, as far as I remember from your article, it took only 10 years to build this collection.
So there's this process which begins in 1892 when Caspar Purden Clark becomes he rises through the hierarchy of the museum, and then he leaves and becomes the first director of the Metropolitan Museum in New York. And so he leaves us with this heritage, which then expands as as time goes through to even to the 1950s, as you see. And so the museum actually becomes the possessor of a range of tiles which is quite representative of Ottoman production, and which puts Ottoman production alongside the production of Iran and India, which were the areas where we'd collected tiles at an earlier date. So it sort of rebalances the collection.
Caspar Purden Clark contributed to the museum's collection, but there's also another key figure, Léon Parvilliers.
Yeah, I use Léon Parvilliers as a sort of a key figure in this story, because in the way that people presented Ottoman art in the 19th century in France and Britain, which are the main countries where it's discussed, is basically they didn't really recognize that there was any Ottoman art at all. They actually say in 1856, Owen Jones, who is the first person associated with the V&A to have come to the institution with a knowledge of the art of the Mediterranean and the Islamic side of the Mediterranean. And so he says in the section on Turkish art in the Grammar of Ornament, this very important book, which is still in print, it sort of says this awful thing, which is Turks are incapable of artistic production. There was a sort of idea that somehow Iranians, because they were Aryan, were naturally artistic, and people who weren't Aryan couldn't be so artistic. And so there is a sort of subset of appreciation which goes to Arab art of a previous period. So this is really quite peculiar. And one of the famous stories is that the Musée de Cluny in Paris acquired a large group of Isnik objects, mostly dishes, which are now in the Musée de la Renaissance in Écouen, just outside Paris, where they have this amazing room which is just entirely filled with Isnik. And they bought that from Rhodes. So the idea they had was that, this isn't Greek, it's Islamic, but it couldn't be Turkish. So they came up with a story which said that the potters had been taken, Persian potters had been taken prisoner by the knights who ruled Rhodes in the pre-Ottoman period, and that therefore they had started to produce high-quality ceramics in Rhodes. And that's why some types of Iznik in the 19th and 20th century were called Rhodian wares. So it's embarrassing to talk about it in Turkey because it's such an appalling racist view of Turks, but one of many aspects of that. And so, why have I gone on about that? What did you ask me?
We were talking about the contribution of Leon Parvier, which one you mentioned, and his projects in Istanbul and Bursa.
Is that he came to Turkey and I can't remember from now what day it was now, but anyway, in the 1860s, he sort of rose in esteem in Istanbul, and he worked on various large houses he came first as a sort of sculptor, probably in plaster, and he's involved in important projects for leading members of Ottoman society. And then in 1863, he's sent to Bursa in order to restore the buildings which had been damaged by the earthquake of the 1850s, I think 1855. And when he was there, he helped himself to some of the objects that were, which he removed from the buildings. And because of that, which may not have seemed to him like theft, it was more like part of his pay, or that it was, he couldn't use these anymore, so there was no museum to put them in, so he took them with him. And because of that, I have found that Turkish art historians generally snarl when you mention his name. They think he's a bit of a criminal. But in fact, Léon Parvier went on in 1874, he published a book on Turkish design, which is the first publication which actually says that there is something called Ottoman art. He actually recognizes that Turks have produced these, the tile work and the other architectural decoration, and he provides a text which actually becomes quite important in terms of the history of tile collecting at the V&A.
And he had done this in spite of many other commentators of the time, like
so he was, so he was in some informal way, he was a student of Viollet-le-Duc. He's this very important rationalist architect in France in the 19th century, and who's, to me at least, is most famous for taking the medieval city of Carcassonne in the south of France and adding lots of medieval-looking features to make it more pretty, which is why it's a big place to go as a tourist these days. So he sort of created a sort of Disneyland approach to the restoration of architecture. Now, when he published his book in 1874, Léon Parvier invited his teacher to write the introduction. And in the introduction, Viollet-le-Duc says the normal things about Turkish art, which is, it's nothing, it's nothing compared to Persian art, that sort of thing. Where in the book, it's in the text itself, Léon Parvier completely ignores that because he's a man with his own ideas, and so I feel that Léon Parvier perhaps is there's quite a lot of interest in France because he goes through this process of working in Turkey, then he goes back to France, and when he's in France, he becomes a producer of tiles. So the reason that he was removing examples from Turkey was he was making his own little V&A in his workshop so that he could use these tiles as example, to generate the new type of tile work he was creating for the French market. And his firm that started to produce tiles was successful enough to carry on after he died, and his sons carried on working on it. But in the 1890s, they ceased making artistic tiles and began to produce porcelain wares, but sort of bathroom porcelain and that sort of thing. So they wanted to sell their collection of tiles that they'd inherited from their father, and the one place to sell it to at that point was the V&A in London, which was then called the South Kensington Museum. And so his collection of tiles, which were purchased by the museum from his sons. And so he's one of the contributors to our tile collection, and among the tiles which they sold us were examples from the Çinili Hamam.
So, for a long time, that items in the collections in European museums weren't described or defined as Ottoman or Turkish. As you said before, many of the tiles were collected without knowing their origin.
So that's that's the great. So I always, at the beginning of my article, I say there is no great sweep in this story. It's not, the truth is that there were, here was a group of people running a museum. They were interested in collecting patterns, but they weren't archaeologists or architectural historians. They weren't that interested in where the patterns came from, what the original context was. And so they would buy large groups of tiles, including the ones in the collection of Léon Parvier, and they were from lots of different sources. And so we ended up acquiring more than 30 tiles, which for most of the whole of the 20th century, no one in the museum had any idea where they came from, except from a sort of general idea that they're Ottoman. And it's only in the second decade of the 21st century that the museum begins to understand that, me, in fact, I'm working at the museum by then, and I begin to understand that there's this whole group of tiles in our collection that actually came from this building.
So there are two very important documentary evidences finding out that these tiles belong to the Çinili Hamam.
Yeah, so the first news I had of the Çinili Hamam was from Charlotte Maury, who is my equivalent at the Musée du Louvre in Paris. And the Musée du Louvre doesn't have a collection of complete tiles from Çinili Hamam. What it has is some fragments which were given to it by a dealer. I think they were a donation, where the dealer has written Çinili Hamam on the back, spelt in French. And so, because Charlotte was working on the collection of tiles, especially Ottoman tiles, in the Louvre collection, and in the process has made herself quite a specialist in tiles from everywhere in the Middle East. She came to Istanbul to find out which Çinili Hamam these tiles came from. So she tried the one in Üsküdar, and that clearly wasn't the source of the tiles. And then she came here, and she saw in the building the remains of tiles which resembled the ones in the Louvre collection. And so that's the point at which we begin to understand that these tiles come from a single building. But it's also, of course, the point at which the hammam was bought for restoration to public use. And Charlotte put us in touch with the people running the project, and they began to visit us. And it became obvious that we eventually selected the tiles out of our collection that were associated with Çinili Hamam. And part of that process was through people coming from Çinili Hamam to see our tiles. And so we're able to supply images which have been the source of some of the restoration. So the fragments found here can be matched in lots of cases to whole tiles which exist in the V&A. And though we have more than 30 tiles, it seems a lot, but it's actually quite a small fragment of the number of tiles that were taken off the building in 1874.
But they have been instrumental in completing the designs together with the museum team.
Yeah. So, but what I'm saying is that there's an enormous number of Çinili Hamam tiles out there. So, every now and then somebody says, "Oh, I've got some of those." When I meet somebody who's a bit of a collector.
And not all of them could have been sold to some institution. Probably some of them have been lost to time fires, earthquakes, probably.
Oh, from here? Yes.
Yeah, here.
So it's whatever was left was sold off.
But I think there should be much more than 30 or something like that.
Yeah, hundreds and hundreds.
That were sold in Paris or London
Maybe
through dealers.
thousands.
And
so but it's really the process that's going on here which will make people in auction houses and dealerships understand that what they're dealing with is tiles from the Çinili Hamam. And so the process was that I was just going to talk about that one. One of the parts of the process was that the tiles, we know the name of this person who bought the tiles from the owners of the Hamam in 1874, and he was Ludovic Lupti. But unlike other dealers at the time, I've not been able to find any trace of him, except that his name is recorded in two sources. One of them is that just like the Louvre was given fragments of tiles, so another group of tiles, 30, as it says here, 30 fragments, were given to the Musée des Beaux-Arts in Lyon, and they actually recorded where they come from. So it was a Paris dealer whose birthplace was Lyon, whose family was still associated with Lyon, called Monseigneur, had given the museum in Lyon a group of fragments in poor condition, but what he tells them is that they were removed from the Çinili Hamam in 1874 by Ludovic Lupti, and then the other source that we know of that explains what went on is this anonymous layiha, or memorandum, that was given to Sultan Abdulhamid. And this was a document, a very long document, describing the terrible condition of traditional crafts and arts of the Ottomans in Turkey. And it was sort of trying to get the government and the Sultan Hamid and the government to understand that they needed to do something about the fact that it was a little bit like the story of the founding of the V&A, that people were worried that Turkey was losing out because the craft skills and design skills that were much admired abroad were being lost in Turkey. And one of the examples he gives, in fact the main example he gives about tiles, is to do with the Çinili Hamam. And he says that, that 12 years ago, which we know was 1874, so we think the document's from 1886, that he goes to Çinili Hamam, he comes here, and he buys some of the tiles off of Ludovic, who's obviously Ludovic Lupti, and he talks a lot about the different prices. First of all, there's the price at which they're sold to Ludovic Lupti, that he then buys 60 tiles, and he has to pay, I think, 50 piastres, so that's a profit of 20 piastres, or that's gurush, on each tile. And then, of course, they get to Paris and they cost 24 francs. So he's a very well-informed person, and he knows he knows that he's paying quite a low price, but it's more than Ludovic got. But he knows they'll fetch a much higher price when they get to Paris. And he's using this example of the fact that the heritage of craft and design of the empire is being whisked away to Paris, which was the main market at the time.
Yeah, I would just ask that question. I mean, Paris seems to be the center of this kind of trade. Could we talk about this? How, for example, these things find their ways through other countries in Europe, including, of course, London, where we'll finally go?
Yeah, I mean, so far, the only sources we've found for sort of these early collections is the only information we have is on France and the trade here, and then how people interested in tiles, and they're always in the south of England, who clearly had access to people who were bringing stuff from Paris, or they went to Paris themselves. And so you have collectors. So if we know that the tiles were removed in 1874, we know that John Henderson who was a collector who died in 1878, he had already collected some tiles. He'd already bought some tiles from the Çinileri Hamam, which he must have done in Paris or through a dealer who brought them from Paris within the 4 years between 1874 and 1878, which is when he dies and he gives them to the British Museum. So it's that sort of distribution we can actually understand from the records of the British Museum and especially the V&A, how the tiles were entering collections in the south of England, and that so there was a sort of stock available for Caspar Purden Clark to start acquiring when he changes the policy of the museum, and we begin to buy Ottoman tiles in 1892 onwards. And so it's not possible to trace it back, through the original purchases to Paris and then back to Istanbul. But we can see the effects of that distribution from Paris. And it doesn't come as a surprise, because in all aspects of art from the Middle East, Paris was the main center. So it was the center of the carpet trade, for example. So when the V&A wants to buy important historical carpets, it knows that it can go to Paris and buy them. It's that, and at the moment it's actually London which is the centre for the auction trade in it, in Middle Eastern art. But at that point it was Paris.
So how did this collecting behavior start? I mean, before these tiles were just seen as design items, but then they started to become collectible items, and there are some important figures
yes.
collecting these. So, can we talk about them a little?
So what happened was that the V&A started to collect this material, and it was ahead of the game. So I'm not talking about the tiles, because obviously they didn't collect those till the 1890s very seriously, but from lots of types of production, ceramics and metalwork and things, the V&A was buying stuff first. But that influenced the taste of collectors in Britain, because they got to know the different types of products of good quality that there had been produced. And so you have people like George Salting, who's a very rich person who collects art on a massive scale. He collected Iznik vessels, and he collected so many that he didn't have anywhere to put them, and so he lent them to the museum. And then in 1909, when he died, he left the museum his collection. So there's a sort of, that's just one example, there's a sort of dialogue between a group of collectors in London and the museum. They work with the museum as well as making collections of their own. And that's part of the story in the late 19th century, in a way.
So could we say Victor and Albert V&A was also instrumental in affecting collectors' behaviors, maybe? Yeah. And what about other collectors like William Joseph Myers, Henry Villette, and...
Yeah. So, I was explaining the other day, well, it's very, most of the time I have to work for my research on objects and trying to find out, unlike the people in the 19th century, I want to know the history of objects, why they were produced, and their subsequent history, such as collecting, is also interesting. But when you move from the world of Ottoman art and using historical documents to the world of British history, which is what these collectors are part of some aspect of British history, is this amazing change in the accessibility of the sources. So as I went through the, because I had never heard of several of the people who collected Çinili Hamam tiles and then gave them or sold them to the museum. But then I found that it was very easy to actually find out about these people. So you have this generation of collectors in the late 19th century, who the most famous of whom is Sir Frederick Leighton, who's a considerable artist of the period, but also people who collect and oh yes, we'll probably yes. So so they collect for their own purposes, and one of them, for example, Henry Willett, who died in 1905, he had been collecting British ceramics, and he collected enough to create a complete political history of British ceramic production in the 18th and 19th century, which is now in Brighton and Hove Museum. And so Brighton Museum, you can visit it and you see this amazing collection, which is not about how you make ceramics, but it's about how British history has been reflected in ceramics. So they would make, they were busts of Nelson or anti-slavery objects and that sort of thing. So as a side issue, he also collected tiles. And when he died, he'd given all his British ceramics to the museum, but the heirs sold off the rest of his collection, and among those were some very fine examples of Çinili Hamam tiles. Now, a different case was that of Frederick Leighton, and he is one of the great figures in British painting in the late 19th century, but I think he's probably even more famous now for his house, which he had built. And as the second stage of building his house, he added something called the Arab Hall, which is what you can see here. And he went to Syria in the 1870s, and he was obviously entranced by the tiled interiors of Syria, and so he began to collect tiles with the idea of creating an Arab-style interior in London. And he died in 1896, having created this, what's now quite a famous room in Leighton House in Kensington. And obviously this is because it's called an Arab Hall, it's received quite a lot of attention both from British researchers, but also it's much loved by Arabs. I know lots of people who like to have events in this house because they're able to use this very beautiful room. But of course, everyone's been focusing on the Arab tiles, the Syrian tiles, which were also Ottoman, and also there are a few Iranian tiles, but no one noticed that and no one had actually sort of been able to have an idea about what the tiles mounted in the walls were. And of course, there is quite a large collection of Çinili Hamam tiles. So these tiles were bought by Lord Leighton, and they must have come as a batch that were together. So they weren't mixed up with lots of other tiles, and they weren't just like honoured as historical objects. They were used in a new scheme of decoration, and they actually cut them up and rearranged them in order to make new patterns. So that's what you can see. Here you've got individual tiles set into the walls of another part of the house, which is the entrance hall, which is mostly tiled using these very, very beautiful dark turquoise tiles, which were made by quite a famous British potter called William de Morgan. But there are highlights where you get Çinili Hamam tiles placed into the centre of these monochrome displays, and then you've got in the Arab Hall itself. There's a frieze of white marble underneath the ceiling, and in lots of places there are these arrangements of Çinili Hamam tiles. So this project has led to the identification of tiles in one of the most famous interiors in London.
And can we go back to some tiles in your collection? Yes, we started here.
Yeah, so during these 8 different purchases or gifts, which go from 1892 until 1892 to 1953, it turns out that we had more than 30 tiles acquired, and we don't have all of the patterns, but we have a very good selection of the patterns used at the hammam. And you can see in that, for example, in this slide, you can see two tiles which do in fact have the same pattern.
There's a pointer there, if you like.
Oh, is that what it is? I thought it was a pen. Yes, so this one and this one are the same design, and that's more common in terms of the border tiles.
Next.
Yeah. Oh, but we have these the small triangle. Yes, these border tiles. We generally have more than one example of these, but they're often in very bad condition. So these are the good examples. And yeah, so I mean the tiles can be linked to the production that's made for the palace in 1528, and I think you can see these tiles here at the top of this very famous assemblage on the outside of the Çinilerin is very similar to this tile, which was one of those from the Çinili Hamam. And so of course, in terms of not only were they not interested in the origins of the tiles and their history of why they were made in the first place, but also the understanding of the development of Ottoman art wasn't very precise in terms of in the 1890s and 1900s when most of the tiles were acquired. But it's quite important for the collection of the museum that we have these, because some of the tiles are very important, sort of good examples of some of the best type of Ottoman production from the first half of the 16th century. So here you have the famous, one of the famous panels and huge panels by sökülüp, which decorate the sünnet odası. And so the tiles that we have from the Çinili Hamam are sort of good examples of that style, and they're quite rare in terms of the collection of the, apart from,
Thinking also their current condition also.
Yes, relatively good,
almost
yes.
intact.
Except, of course, one of the interesting things is that the tile at the top, this one, you can see the whole pattern, but actually it's rather cramped at the edges, and that's because part of the tile has been removed. And this was often the case, that when the tiles were removed, they were broken in some way. So these tiles would probably have small breaks in the edges. And so what I presume it's what Ludovic Lukti did, was he actually worked outside in the courtyard, and he had people cutting the edges of the tiles so they were even. But in that respect, we've actually lost the outside of the pattern. And so not only the excavations here and the restoration work has not only shown where the tiles came from, but we can also understand what happened when they were taken off the wall and processed out there in the courtyard.
So some of these tiles removed from the hammam lost their continuity of design because of being carved out of
but they're still very attractive, I think.
And this is Arab Hall again. And yes, so back to history and how the tiles and how the restoration started here.
Yeah.
So you have been involved in this project for how long with Çinili Hamam?
Well, I think it was about 2012, I think.
2012, so after the...
13 years, yeah.
So
long time.
Almost concurrently with the start of the restoration process. Then
Yeah,
it's
I think
this 13, 14.
How they, this was about maybe the first or second time I came here, and it was fascinating to see how all of these architectural features were there in very relatively good condition, considering how old they are, but they'd been covered by the later layers of plaster, and the plaster's been taken off, and we can see the sort of the original decoration of the bathhouse, but also
the niche, the mukarnas
those mukarnas niches. But then also the chipping away of the plaster Next slide. Yeah, then provides you with the beds, which you can see when you go around the hammam, which shows what shape of tile was combined with what shape of tile. So there are different types of layouts for the tiles, and this is what the people working on the project produced in terms of different types of layout. But of course, the great puzzle here is, can we see the next one? Is that in very few places do enough tiles survive. Basically, there's one type of revetment where we know that what sort of border tile was used and what sort of hexagonal tile formed the main pattern. And that's, so it's really through this work that we also begin, not only do we understand that all these tiles come from the same place, but also we begin to understand how they were used together. And so I'm looking forward, to being able to display the tiles we have in a way that gives them their architectural context.
This is a computer-generated trial. So, what do you think, what role can these Çinili Hamam tiles, now that 37 design patterns are discovered and there are estimates about how they were placed, the tessellations, the revetments, and now with this information in mind, what role will these tiles play in Victoria Albert's presentation of Ottoman art? And if you want to comment on other institutions.
Yeah, well, obviously it's really enhanced our knowledge of our collection, and it's sort of individual. This is something that's been going on much more rapidly than happened in the past. People supplying information about where our tiles come from. Charlotte is often the source of this, and it allows us to the actual main display of my section's collection. It changes really quite slowly. So during my time at the museum, we had one major redisplay that opened in 2006. So I went to the museum in 2002. I worked on the redisplay. It happened in 2006. And we really expect that sort of display to last for decades. And so this is part of the sort of the research effort that takes place between these major redisplays in terms of, so the product of that will be seen in the next redisplay. And that doesn't, we have one major gallery on the ground floor, which is called the Islamic Middle East, because we have to lump, Iran, the Arab world, and Turkey and Islamic Spain all together, because that's the space we've been given. And but we also have other sorts of galleries where we show the material. I mean, in the tradition of an art and design museum, rather a historical museum, we have enormous galleries of ceramics, for example. So, and those were completed in 2010. So they're going to be a long period before we have time to redo those. But so I look forward to the time in the future when the Çinili Hamam tiles actually take a place in the main gallery, because I think they're important enough for that. And we, in the meantime, if we do exhibitions on Ottoman-related material, then obviously it would be great to sort of premiere a group of tiles that have been in the collection at least 70 years, sometimes more than 100 years, and which have been sort of orphans before, and now we know which family they belong to.
And the discovery that the tiles in your collection, I mean these 37 tiles, belong to Çinili Hamam, does it pose questions on other items in your collection, the provenance of which is questionable, or maybe there are not any?
Well, I mean, obviously the provenance issues are a big point to be investigated today. So we we try to be provide as much information as we can, and the whole, the issue is also generates work by other people, which shows either that things have been acquired in some way that's immoral, and other objects which are acquired from the market in a way which was seen as normal at the time. And I mean, it is it's really quite disturbing to read the accounts of 19th century museum curators whose focus is on making sure that their collection is as good as possible, and that's sort of normal among collectors and museum curators even today. But they just don't have no concept. I mean, of the fact that this is other people's cultural heritage, and so I suppose in this case it's been a great pleasure to actually refocus the history of a whole group of tiles, but also to link it to the building that it comes from, which of course has undergone this amazing transformation.
So do you think, I mean, I don't know how the market works, but do you think new tiles from Çinili Hamam may show up in the markets?
Do. Every year you see individual ones. And of course what will happen is that because people now know which building they come from, and especially as the building is so glamorous now, this will give them added cachet. The scales will fall from people's eyes, and they'll see how beautiful these tiles are, and so probably the price will go up.
So you had the chance to tour the museum, not all of it, before the talk. What do you think of it? I mean, presentation-wise.
Well, it's extremely good. Yes, I really enjoyed it.
Because also Çinili Hamam team was also very eager to hear your opinion about.
Oh, no, I really liked it. It's strange, of course, because I'm looking at a museum telling me things that I already know, but it's at that point that I really enjoyed it, despite the fact that I knew the story already. It was very entertaining to go through it. I think the presentation is excellent, and it's true to the place. In other words, the removal of most of the tiles is part of the history of the hammam, but the excavations allowed part of the material that forms part of that history of removal to be told in a way that isn't negative. And I mean, it's not so much. It is a negative story, but if you own the story and present it in that way that makes it look, the tiles look very beautiful, even though they're fragments, and it tells the story of making a big effort to discover how the hammam looked when it was first built, but also the honesty to say that that's not possible to reconstruct in a way that might satisfy a perfectionist. But I think it creates a very interesting story that I will happily go and look at again. And I thought even the material on bath practices of the past was presented in a very, some of it is very pretty, but it's sort of ethnographic material. But actually, if you treat that material with respect, and you light it and place and design the displays well, it does end up looking very beautiful, which is what I think is true of the museum. But also, it comes with very, very good interpretation, telling you who a telak was, and which peoples actually worked in this building. I think that's I like that as well. And it's what it reminded me of is at the moment there's an exhibition in Paris in the Institut du Monde Arabe, which is called Parfum d'Orient, which is about the use of incense and perfumes in the Arab world. And that has also a very, most of the objects that go with that are they're not very large, and they're not very, they're very diverse, let's say. And they too they've used a designer who's brought the whole thing to life. It's quite extraordinary. And I have a very, very high opinion of that exhibition, partly because it delivers the sense to you through quite an advanced technology, partly because it includes lots of contemporary Arab responses to the theme of the exhibition, which are very informative and beautiful. But partly it has also this idea that you take the objects of everyday life, luxury end of objects, and you just rely on them actually being very attractive in themselves. And I think so this is the second exhibition I've seen this year which does that, and I think they're both very good.
And also, you had the chance to see the Hamam because you weren't here for the opening.
No, but I was here before when it's... So
yes.
I'm almost used to it now.
Yeah, I mean...
Yes, because I came here for the Biennale installation.
Yes. So you, as I understand from your opinion about the museum as well, you totally support the idea of not recreating the, replicating the tiles and leaving it as it is, and moving these things, the imagination and presentation of it, to the museum.
Yes, and it didn't take me very long. I think I'd already come to the conclusion that I was hoping that there wasn't going to be a recreation of that, because either the process would have produced something that, you know, when you do when you're an Iznik painter, they're very talented and they're very skillful. So they paint the scenes probably using transfers, but they do it in a way that is in which the process gives life to the design, because you make little changes all the time, and we can't actually detect the changes. But if you do it, since the 19th century, there's been these different new means of controlling the actions of a painter, and you can even, of course, make them mechanically, and a sort of sameness occurs within production, which creates a sort of frozenness about it, which isn't the same as a handmade product in the old way. And so I think that even, you know, obviously we're used to the tiles being in a bad condition. It would be quite shocking to see a whole new load of tiles that were in perfect condition. So that's quite a shock. Maybe not for the public who came here, but and I think also that it's very difficult to recreate the naturalness of the original revetment. But of course, the other thing is apart from the one case that we saw, we don't know where which tile went. So it would always be an approximation. So I think on those bases, I'm very happy with the way they've used marmara. Capidar marble. What do you call it?
Marmara marble.
Yeah, yes, because we use this long Greek word in English for it, which I've forgotten now. Anyway, what do you call it? What's it called in Turkish?
Marmara marble.
Marmara marble.
Yes.
Yeah. It's become, there's some, in lots of work with this marble more recently, people have understood this old Byzantine thing of actually cutting the marble in two so that it makes a nice pattern.
So, Tim, thank you very much for being with us today. If you want to add anything, you can. I think you'll go on with your tour of the museum. You were quite taken, I think, by it.
Çok teşekkürler bizimle olduğunuz için. Söyleşilerimizin sonuncusu önümüzdeki hafta olacak. Orada da aslında Tim Stanley'nin Bora Keskiner'le yazdığı ve Çinili Hamam'da şiir ve hat sanatıyla ilgili bir makale vardı. Bora Bey'le biz Zoom üzerinden bir söyleşi yapacağız. O da önümüzdeki cumartesi YouTube kanalından yayınlanacak Zeyrek Çinili Hamam'ın. Bu söyleşi de aynı şekilde altyazılı olarak yayınlanacak. Geldiğiniz için çok teşekkürler. Hoşça kalın.